The morning of Lady Ashmore's 12th night assembly. The frost came down so hard on Stoneleigh Village that the puddles in the lane turned to glass before 5 o'clock, and the light that managed to press through the clouds was the particular grey of pewter, left too long unused. Miss Cecily Vane was not invited. She had not expected to be. In the 3 months since she had come to Thornfield Park as governess to the 2 young Fairfax daughters, she had learned the precise dimensions of her position with a thoroughness that would have impressed a surveyor. She ate in the schoolroom. She walked the children in the kitchen garden rather than on the gravel sweep. She did not appear at dinner. She did not appear at morning calls. She did not appear at all as far as the county was concerned, because she was not the sort of person who appeared. She was the sort of person who remained, quietly, in rooms without fires, doing the work that made other people's appearances possible. She stood at the schoolroom window, now 8-year-old Harriet pressed against her side, and 5-year-old Clara on her hip, and watched the carriages come up the long drive below them, their lanterns swinging gold against the dark. From here she could see the assembled guests stepping down onto the torchlit stone. Lady Ashmore's niece, in ivory satin, the vicar's wife resplendent in a velvet she wore once a year, and there, pausing at the carriage door to speak to his groom, was Richard Kellam, the Earl of Drayton. She had not let herself look at him directly. In 3 months, she looked now, briefly. Because the window was dark enough, and the distance sufficient, and because there was no one to watch her look. He was not a comfortable man to behold. Tall, and carrying himself with the particular compression of a person who had learned to take up less room than his nature demanded. His face in the lantern light was severe, the jaw set, the dark eyes passing once across the facade of the house before he moved toward the entrance. He did not look up at the schoolroom window. She had not expected him to. "Who is that man, Miss Vane?" Harriet asked. "Lord Drayton," she said. "He is the Earl of Drayton. He lives at Kellam Hall, 2 miles east. Mrs. Forsyth says he is very proud. Mrs. Post." "Forsyth is the housekeeper," Cecily said, "and her opinion of a peer of the realm is not something you are required to carry." Harriet considered this with the gravity of 8 years. "But is he?" Cecily set Clara down. "Come. You will both be in bed before the guests have finished their first set." She did not answer the question because she did not know how to answer it honestly, and she had made herself a rule 3 years ago that she would not answer questions dishonestly to children. She had been watching Lord Drayton in her careful peripheral way since the Tuesday in October when he had arrived at Thornfield Park to return the elder Mr. Carriage, Fairfax's spaniel, which had found its way onto the grounds of Kellam Hall in pursuit of something it never caught. He had handed the dog to the footman. He had inquired after the children. He had turned, and in turning, his eye had fallen on Cecily, where she stood at the top of the stairs, with Clara's sash in her hand. And he had paused, not the polite pause of a gentleman acknowledging a servant, but the particular arrested stillness of a man who has registered something he did not expect to register. Then the footman had offered him tea, and the moment closed, she had not thought of it again, or rather she had thought of it exactly 17 times since October, and each time had arranged her thoughts on some more productive subject. The assembly below filled the house with music. She read to the girls until they slept, then sat in the schoolroom chair with her lamp and her mending, and the faint sound of a country dance rising through the floorboards, and she did not allow herself to feel anything about it at all. She was very good at not feeling things about her situation. She had been practicing for 3 years. Before Thornfield Park, there had been the Whitmore house in Bath, where she had lasted 11 months before Mrs. Stex. Whitmore decided she was too quiet, and the children find her unnerving. Before that there had been the Graysons, where she had lasted 14 months before the second son had behaved badly, and she had found it necessary to remove herself and her character. She was 23 years old. She was the daughter of a vicar who had died without a pension, and a mother who had followed him into death 6 months later, and she was possessed of a tolerably good education, an extraordinarily small salary, and the particular quality of dignity that people in comfortable circumstances found vaguely irritating. Because it did not diminish, the music stopped sometime after midnight. She went to her room, which was on the upper floor and had no hearth fire. and she lay under her 2 blankets and listened to the carriages rattling back down the drive, and she slept without dreaming of anything. She had not been at Thornfield Park long enough to know that the Earl of Drayton had stayed behind after the last guest departed, and sat for 40 minutes in the Fairfax's study with Mr. Fairfax, and had then ridden home in the cold dark alone. She would learn this later from Harriet, who learned everything. The first time someone said it to her face was 3 days after the assembly, in the entrance hall of Thornfield Park, when Lady Ashmore came to return a borrowed piece of sheet music and found Cecily descending the stairs with both girls ahead of her and a geography primer tucked under her arm. Lady Ashmore looked at her the way one looks at a piece of furniture that has been placed inconveniently in a passage. She said to Mrs. Fairfax, in the carrying voice of a woman who had never needed to moderate her volume in her life, "Your quiet governess. Still here, is she? I expected you would have done something about that by now." Mrs. Fairfax laughed a little uneasily. "The children are very attached." "The children," Lady Ashmore said, "will attach themselves to anything that stays still long enough. A governess who doesn't manage to make herself noticed is barely a governess at all." Cecily did not pause on the stairs. She continued at the same pace, gathered Clara's hand at the bottom step, and walked both girls toward the schoolroom without altering the arrangement of her face by a single feature. She had been told at various points in the past 3 years that she was too steady, too contained, and not quite warm enough to be truly useful, and she had decided early that these observations said more about the people who voiced them than about her. She did not tell the children what had been said. She did not discuss it with anyone. She set out the maps, and she conducted the lesson. The Earl came to Thornfield Park 4 days later, in the company of Mr. Fairfax, and this time Cecily saw him from the garden through the gate in the kitchen wall, where she had taken the girls to draw the bare winter trees. He was not in riding clothes. He was in his town coat, his cravat precisely folded, his hat in his hand, and he was listening to something Mr. Fairfax was saying with a quality of attention that she recognized, because it was the same quality she used herself, not patient tolerance, but genuine hearing, the kind that is rarer than it is claimed. He looked up once, toward the garden gate. She did not look away quickly enough. He did not look away either. It was 2 or 3 seconds, no more, and then Mr. Fairfax said something, and the Earl turned and followed him inside. She stood very still for a moment, the drawing book open in her hand, the pencil she had been holding pressed against her palm. Harriet had not noticed. Harriet was sketching the apple tree with great conviction and no accuracy. Clara had found a stone whose shape pleased her, and was examining it with great seriousness. She thought with the particular clearness that comes immediately after a thing that cannot be made unclearer. He looked at you. She thought that, and then she thought. With the same flat clearness that is not enough, that is not a fact with weight. Gentlemen look at governesses for all manner of reasons, and the reasons are rarely the ones that do not harm. She had been looked at before, and she had been careful before, and the careful thing was to draw the elm and conduct the lesson. Clara tugged at her skirt. "Miss Vane, you have not drawn anything." "No," she agreed, "I have not." She drew a bare elm, careful and accurate, each branch rendered with the attention she gave to things she was not thinking about, and she did not allow herself to think about what it meant, that he had not looked away, because there was no version of that thought that ended well for a woman in her position. The second time someone said it was in the village, at the draper's, on a Thursday afternoon in January, when she had taken Harriet to purchase ribbon for a new sash. She had almost finished her errand, and was waiting for the ribbon to be measured, when she became aware that Mrs. Doble, the solicitor's wife, was speaking to her companion in the particular audible undertone that is not meant to be overheard, and is meant to be overheard. "Lord Drayton came to dine at the Fairfaxes on Tuesday," Mrs. Doble was saying. "3 times this month. One wonders what precisely draws him." "They have an eligible niece," the companion offered. "They have no niece in residence." A pause, and then with the particular satisfaction of someone landing the point she had aimed at from the beginning. What they have is a quiet governess who doesn't know how to make herself small enough. I told Martha Fairfax she ought to have done something about the girl by now. Harriet, who had excellent hearing and a child's pure honesty, turned from the ribbons and said clearly, "That is Miss Vane you are speaking of." Cecily put her hand on Harriet's shoulder, gently, but with the particular pressure that meant, "Be still." And she said to the draper, "The blue, please. 4 inches." She did not look at Mrs. Doble. She paid, she collected Harriet, and she walked them both out into the cold lane. "You should have said something," Harriet said. "What would you have had me say? That you are not a girl? That you are 25 and very clever?" 23, she said, "and cleverness does not require an audience." The wind was sharp along the lane. She tucked Harriet's collar up and they walked back toward the park in silence. And she made herself think about the afternoon's lesson and the letter she needed to write to an agency in London about a possible next position, because Mrs. Fairfax had been looking at her for 2 weeks in the particular way of a woman who is working herself up to saying something unpleasant. She had begun that letter and left it unfinished 3 times. What stopped her was not hope. She would have been embarrassed to call it hope. It was simply that she had not quite finished what she had started with Harriet and Clara, and she did not like to leave things unfinished. Harriet was working through the 3rd volume of Rollin and was beginning to understand fractions. Clara had recently produced a sentence in French that contained a subjunctive. These were small things, but they were hers. She was thinking about this the following Tuesday evening when she heard him downstairs. Not his voice specifically, because the schoolroom was 2 floors above the dining room, but the low register of a voice she had, without intending to, learned to distinguish. She did not go to the landing. She sat with her lamp and her primer, and she thought about Harriet's fractions until the clock in the hall below struck 10. The next morning she found on the schoolroom table a small volume of travels in Greece, bound in calf, with a calling card tucked inside the front cover. The card said, in a precise hand, "For the continuation of the girl's geography education." No signature beyond the engraved name and title. She held it for a long moment. Then she set it on the shelf with the other books, and she went to wake the children. She did not thank him directly, because she had no occasion to do so, and because she was almost entirely certain that to thank him would be to acknowledge something that she was not ready to acknowledge, and that he might not wish acknowledged. She thanked him instead by using the book. She incorporated the plates into the Wednesday lesson, and when he came to dine the following Friday, and Mr. Fairfax mentioned in passing that the governess had reorganized the schoolroom geography holdings. She was not in the room to see his face. She heard this, too, from Harriet. There was a moment, late in January, that she had not expected, and that she had thought about every day since. She had been in the library at 6:30 in the morning, which was technically against the rules of the household, but in practice not enforced, because no one else in the household had any occasion to be in the library at 6:30. She went there on Tuesday mornings for 40 minutes before the girls woke, because the library had a fire banked from the night before and she was cold. She had been there perhaps 20 minutes, standing at the shelves with a volume of natural history she had found that might serve for spring lessons, when the door opened and Lord Drayton came in. He stopped in the doorway. She did not drop the book. She nearly did, and then she controlled it, and she stood with the book in both hands and looked at him steadily, and waited for him to determine how they would manage this. He said, "I beg your pardon. I did not know anyone would be here." "Nor did I," she said. There was a pause. He did not leave, which surprised her, and she did not move to leave herself, which surprised her more. He said, "How do you find the household, Miss Vane?" "Comfortable," she said, which was not precisely true, but was the correct answer. "The children are doing well?" "Very well. Harriet has a genuine aptitude for languages. Clara is more naturally gifted in mathematics." He nodded, as though this were information he had expected. "You will not be here much longer," he said. And it was not quite a question. She looked at him directly. What makes you say so? Mrs. Fairfax is a woman who takes her cues from the county, he said. And the county has decided that your continued presence in this house is inconvenient. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, I am aware. Are you making arrangements? I have begun a letter to an agency. Something shifted in his face, very slightly. At that he said, Do not send it yet. I beg your pardon. He had already looked away toward the shelves. The fire in here is well banked, he said. You should make use of it while it lasts. And he went to the desk by the window and opened the folio that was waiting there. And that was the end of the conversation, and she stood for another 8 minutes in front of the shelves and could not have told anyone afterward what she had read. She had not sent the letter. It sat on the small desk in her room, addressed and sealed, for 4 days. She looked at it every morning when she dressed. She had held it over the candle twice, and withdrawn her hand twice, which she did not examine too carefully, because the examination would require her to name what she was doing, and she was not ready to name it. The honest answer, if she had been required to give one, was that she did not want to go. Not because of Harriet and Clara, though, she would miss them with a specificity that surprised her. Not because the room, small and cold as it was, had become familiar in the way all rooms eventually became. It was something more particular and more embarrassing than that. It was the library, at 6:30. It was the fact that someone had, for 3 minutes at an open door, spoken to her as though her thinking mattered, and then said a thing she did not know what to do with, and gone. She could not have explained why, except that she was 23, and she had not yet entirely stopped believing that something could, occasionally, be meant. The Earl of Drayton had his own reasons for saying what he said, which he had not told her, and which she would not learn until later. His wife had died 4 years ago, in childbed with the child, and he had blamed himself in the specific and unanswerable way of a man who was present and could not prevent a thing and would never entirely stop calculating what he might have done differently. The portrait was in the smaller sitting room at Kelham Hall, turned to face the wall, which he had done not in grief, but in something more complicated, a grief that had calcified into a belief that he was the kind of man whose judgment could not be trusted in matters of great consequence. He had not, in 4 years, looked seriously at a woman. He had in 3 months looked at Cecily Vane on 17 occasions, which was the same number she had looked at him, which neither of them knew. He had watched her in October, walked 2 children through a rain-soaked kitchen garden, stopping to name every plant they asked about, answering wrong only twice, and correcting herself both times, without embarrassment. He had watched her, in November, prevent a careless footman from frightening Clara with a door slammed in the dark corridor, interposing herself between the child and the sound, with a calm that had nothing performing in it. He had watched her, in December, answer Lady Ashmore's cool inquiry about the girl's music progress with 3 sentences of precise, measured information, delivered with the contained dignity of a woman who had decided some time ago that she would not be made small. He had thought each time that she was the most competent person in the house. He had thought, for the first time in 4 years, that he was in some danger. If you are finding yourself invested in Miss Vane, stay close. What is coming will arrive quietly, the way all things of consequence arrive. He was still thinking about the library on the morning of the 3rd of February when Mrs. Fairfax appeared at Kelham Hall unannounced, and was shown into his drawing room and informed him, in the apologetic, circumlocutory manner, of a woman who knows she is doing something unkind, and would prefer not to examine that knowledge too directly, that she had found it necessary to give Miss Vane notice. The girls, she explained, had grown rather too attached. The relationship between a governess and her charges should remain professional, and she feared it had become something other. He listened to this without expression. He said, "When does her notice expire?" "The end of the week." A pause. "My lord, I hope you will not think I have said anything to suggest," she began. "Thank you," he said, "for informing me." He sat for a long time after she left, looking at the fire. He had been 14 months in the house when Eleanor died. They had been civil to each other, which was what the match had been designed for, and he had thought that civility was sufficient, and that love was an ambition for people with more leisure than he possessed. He had been wrong about that. Not in the way he had once thought. Not with the guilt of a man who had failed to feel enough, but with the quieter and more precise understanding that he had not known what to look at. He had looked at surfaces only. The correct family, the correct nature, the correct station. He had not known how to look at the thing underneath, the particular quality of a person's integrity in small unwitnessed moments, and the child and Eleanor had both died in a November week, and he had spent 4 years not knowing whether the failure was his character or only his ignorance. That evening, he went to the portrait in the smaller sitting room and turned it back to face the room. He sat across from it for an hour, which was the first time he had done so in 2 years, and he said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and because what he needed to settle he could not settle in language, but had to settle in the older and less articulate place where his certainty lived when it was certain. He had been watching her for 3 months, and what he had watched was not surfaces. He had watched her in unwitnessed moments, again and again, and she was the same in each of them, patient and precise and quietly principled in the very specific way of someone whose values are not performance but structure. By 10 o'clock he knew what he was going to do. He was not, he thought, the kind of man whose judgment could be trusted in matters of great consequence. He thought this as clearly and as honestly as he always thought it. Yet he was also the kind of man who had been watching for 3 months a woman hold herself together inside conditions that would have broken someone with less foundation, and he thought perhaps it was possible, on careful and specific evidence, to make one decision that was not wrong. The third and last time someone said it was on the evening before her final day, at a dinner Cecily was not attending, at the Doble house in the village where Mrs. Churrs. Fairfax had accepted an invitation, and where Lady Ashmore had mentioned to the general table that she understood Miss Vane had been given her notice at last. And about time, too, as the quiet governess had always been rather more present than her position warranted. And perhaps that was the trouble with girls who came from nothing. They did not understand quite how little room they were meant to take up. Cecily was in the schoolroom. She was finishing the letter to the agency. Clara was asleep. 1. Harriet had cried earlier, very quietly, and had been very dignified about it. And Cecily had held her hand and told her that she was not going because of anything Harriet had done, which was the truth, and that she would write, which she intended. She was sealing the letter when she heard it begin to snow outside, the particular soft percussion of the first flakes against the window glass. She thought about the library and the fire banked from the night before, and his voice saying, "Do not send it yet." She had sent it. What else could she do? She was 23, and she had 2 weeks' wages coming, and no certainty of anything, and the world did not pause its machinery to accommodate the things people almost said to each other in libraries at 6:30. She slept fitfully, and woke before the light, which in February came late and gray, and without announcement the house was very quiet. Below she could hear the kitchen stirring, the first sounds of a household at 5 in the morning, the setting of grates, the distant closing of a door. She dressed by candle and braided her hair, and looked at the 2 small trunks stacked by the door, which contained the whole of everything she possessed, and she thought that she had done what she could here, and she would do what she could somewhere else, and that was the entirety of what was available to her. She was putting on her coat when Harriet appeared in the doorway in her nightdress, her feet bare, her eyes resolute. "I wanted to be the one to tell you," Harriet said. "Tell me what?" "There is a carriage in the drive." Cecily turned. "Not our carriage," Harriet said. "It came while it was still dark. Patterson says it is Lord Drayton's. It has been there since before 5. The candle in her hand was very still." She was, she thought, the sort of person who had learned not to assume, not to extrapolate, not to build any weight of interpretation on a fact that could bear none of it. She thought this with great clarity. Then she put on her coat, and she went down. The entrance hall was empty, except for Mr. Fairfax's senior footman, Patterson, who looked at her with the particular expression of a man who knows something and is not certain whether he is relieved or alarmed by it. He opened the door without being asked. The carriage was a dark, lacquered traveling vehicle, very well appointed, with 2 horses standing patient in the snow and a coachman on the box in Drayton livery. The snow had been falling since midnight, and it lay unbroken on the park, blue-white in the early light, and the carriage tracks coming up the drive were already softening at the edges. Lord Drayton was standing beside the carriage, not sitting inside it, not sheltered by it, standing beside it in the cold, without his hat, as though he had been there long enough that the formality of waiting inside no longer seemed adequate to what he meant. She stopped on the top step. He looked up at her and said, "Miss Vane." The name, in his voice, in the quiet, was its own kind of argument. She said, "How long have you been here? An hour and a half?" "It is not yet 6 o'clock." She descended the last 2 steps. The snow was several inches deep on the drive and very cold through her thin boots. She stood in front of him and looked at him steadily and waited. He said, "I owe you an explanation." "You are not required to explain a carriage." "No." Something moved in his face. "The carriage is not the explanation. The carriage is what I came to offer. The explanation is that I should have spoken sooner, and I was a coward about it, and I am not generally a coward, and I do not intend to remain one on this specific matter." He paused. "You deserve the honesty first. My wife died 4 years ago. I have believed since then that I was not the kind of man who should make consequential decisions about other people's lives, because my judgment in such matters could not be trusted. And now? Now, he said, I have spent 3 months watching you exercise better judgment than any person in this county, in every situation you have encountered, and I find that my previous position is difficult to maintain." He looked at her directly, which he was very good at and which she had noticed repeatedly over the preceding months. "I am not asking you to accept anything today. I am asking you to get in the carriage. I am asking you to come to Kellam Hall, where my housekeeper will provide you with a room and a fire, and where there will be no more letters to agencies, and no more cold rooms, and no more being told you are too quiet to be noticed. And I am asking you, Cecily, if you will consider the question of whether my suit is one you could look at without entire repugnance." It was the first time he had used her given name. It landed in the cold air between them, and did not dissipate. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the letter she had sent to the agency. She thought about 2 small trunks and 6 years of positions, and the specific and repeated experience of being assessed and found inconvenient by people who had not looked carefully enough to find what was actually there. She thought that he had been standing in the snow for an hour and a half without his hat in the dark, because the formality of waiting inside no longer seemed adequate to what he meant. She said, "I will consider the question." The coachman descended from his box without being asked and opened the carriage door. She turned once and looked up at the schoolroom window. Harriet was there, both hands pressed to the glass, her breath fogging it in the cold. Clara appeared beside her a moment later, a white shape in the gray window. Cecily raised one hand, not a wave exactly, but a held acknowledgement, the kind that does not cheapen the weight of it by trying to reduce it. Then she turned back, and she accepted the Earl of Drayton's hand at the carriage step, and she got in. The carriage was warm inside, which she had not expected. There was a heated brick wrapped in wool at her feet, and a traveling rug folded on the seat, and a small lamp burning in its brass housing on the panel. He sat across from her and pulled the door shut, and the carriage began to move, very slowly, through the snow. She did not speak for a few minutes, nor did he. She watched the park slide past the window, the bare trees standing in their blue-white coats, the drive stretching back toward Thornfield Park as it diminished behind them. The house looked from this angle like something she had already understood, a place she had been, that had been part of what she was, and that she was now moving away from without grief. She said without looking away from the window, "I was a vicar's daughter." "I know," he said. She turned. "You know Fairfax told me in October." A pause. "I asked." She looked at him steadily. What else did you ask? The corner of his mouth moved very slightly, which was the closest she had seen him come to anything that could be called an expression of wry feeling. How long you had been in service, whether the girls had prospered under your care, whether you were in the habit of appearing in the library before 6 in the morning. And what did he say? That he did not know about the library. She held his gaze and felt, for the first time in a considerable while, the very slight internal adjustment of a person who is recalibrating what is available to them. She said, "Your suit is not one I find repugnant." He did not smile. His face, in the early light from the window, altered in some fundamental way, the specific compression of a person who has been holding something under sustained pressure releasing. Not all at once, but enough. He said very quietly, "Good." They traveled through the snow in silence, and the silence was a different kind from the one she was used to. It was not the silence of a room without fire. It was not the silence of a county that had decided to look away from her. It was the silence of two people who had already said the important thing and did not need to fill it with smaller words. Kellam Hall emerged from the trees as the light was coming up properly, golden and low through the bare branches, settling on stone that was older than Thornfield by a century. A long, gray-gold facade with 12 windows on the principal floor and a stable block visible to the left, and at the central door. A woman in black who turned out to be the housekeeper, a person of about 50, with a calm manner and excellent posture, who came forward as the carriage stopped without a trace of surprise on her face, which told Cecily that she had been informed and had her own opinion and had elected to bring it outside. "Miss Vane," she said, "we have a room with a fire and breakfast whenever you are ready." "Thank you," Cecily said. She did not look around to see if he was watching her. She knew he was. She went in. The room she was given was on the second floor, with a window that looked east over the park, and a fire that had clearly been burning for some time, and a small writing desk against the wall. She stood at the window for a moment and watched the snow. It was still falling, light and steady, covering the park in that particular quality of silence that belongs only to mornings when the world has been entirely remade overnight while everyone was sleeping. She thought of Lady Ashmore's carrying voice. She thought of Mrs. Doble at the draper's. She thought of the specific sentence which had been delivered to her by various people in various forms over 6 years, that she was too quiet, too steady, too contained, too present, without being present in the right way. Not quite warm enough, barely a governess at all. She thought that none of them had been wrong, exactly, about the fact. She had always been quiet. She was still quiet. She was standing quietly in a warm room in the Earl of Drayton's house, while the snow came down on the park and a fire crackled behind her. And she was quiet, the way a thing is quiet, when it has arrived somewhere. There was a knock at the door, and when she opened it, it was not the housekeeper, but Lord Drayton himself, which was unusual, and he held in his hand a small folded paper. "This came before I left this morning," he said, "and I think it belongs to you." She opened it. It was from the agency. They had a position available, it said, in Edinburgh beginning in March. She read it once. Then she folded it and handed it back to him. "I do not think I will need it," she said. Something in him stilled. Then he said carefully, "You are certain?" "I am 23, she said, "and I have spent 6 years being told that the things I am are the wrong things to be. I am not going to Edinburgh." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "There is a library here. You are welcome in it." "At any hour, I know," she said. She almost smiled. He saw it, and the lines around his eyes shifted in a way she had not seen before, something warming in them, a small and guarded thing stepping briefly into the light. They stood in the doorway for a moment, separated by the precise distance that propriety required. And there was between them the particular quality of nearness that is not touching, and is not touching. The awareness of the space between two people as its own physical fact. She could hear very distantly a clock ticking somewhere along the corridor, and outside the window, the soft percussion of snow. He said her name again, in the low, level voice that she understood now, been listening for, without knowing what she was listening for. "Cecily, my lord," she said. "Richard," he said. She held that for a moment. Then she said carefully, "Richard." He inclined his head, and the ghost of something that was almost ease moved through his posture, very briefly the way a door opens an inch to show the room beyond before settling again. He said, "I will leave you to your breakfast." "Yes," she said. He went. She stood in the doorway of the warm room and listened to his steps along the corridor until they ceased. And then she went to the window and looked out at the park, where the snow was covering the carriage tracks very slowly, one careful inch at a time, making something new of the ground that had been marked. On the writing desk there was a small object she had not noticed earlier, placed there by some thoughtful hand before she arrived. A miniature in an oval frame. A woman she did not know with pale eyes and a composed expression, set face forward in the frame. She understood what it meant, that it was here rather than turned to the wall, that it had been placed in this room for her to find. She looked at it for a moment, and then she set it carefully to one side. Upright and visible, not displaced, but given its proper place. She sat down at the desk. She opened the small drawer and found paper and pen, and she wrote to Harriet, because she had promised, and because Harriet had stood in her nightgown at the schoolroom window with her hands pressed to the glass, and deserved a letter. And because there was much to say, and she had always been better in prose than in speech. She wrote that she was warm and that the house was very fine, and that she expected the spring would bring word of something good, and that in the meantime Harriet should practice her Latin verbs which had been suffering. She did not write about the carriage, or the snow, or the quality of the light through the window, or the particular way a person's face looks when they have been holding something in compression for 4 years, and have just very carefully set part of it down. She thought about these things, quietly, in the warm room with the fire behind her and the snow outside, and she held them in the way one holds things that are too new and too good to be spoken about yet, that require simply being kept close and careful, until they have had time to become real. He found her in the library at 4 o'clock, which was perhaps not accidental, and she had taken down the volume of travels in Greece and was making notes in the small notebook she kept for lesson planning, and she heard his step on the threshold and looked up without speaking. He came to stand at the window beside her. The park was still and entirely white by now, the afternoon light gone low and golden through the trees. He said, "I should tell you that it need not be arranged quickly. I am aware that you have had no opportunity to consider the question with any care." She looked at him. "I have considered it. In an afternoon, I have been considering it," she said, "for a somewhat longer period than this afternoon." Something moved in his face, very slight, the arrested stillness of a man who has registered something he had not expected to register. Then he said, "How long?" She looked back at the park. "Since October," she said, "since a spaniel came through a fence." He said nothing for a moment. When she looked at him again, the lines around his eyes had shifted, and she thought that this was what he looked like when he was almost not guarded. She thought she would like to see what came after. "Almost, I was not," he said carefully. "Subtle." "No," she agreed. "You were not. You were just quiet about it. And you were very well practiced at not seeing things you were not permitted to have." She looked at him directly. "Yes," she said. "I was." They stood at the window, while the light continued its slow descent through the park, and after a while she turned back to her notebook, and he remained at the window. And neither of them felt the need to fill the time with smaller words than the ones they had already said. That was enough. For now that was more than she had expected. The snow went on falling, soft and steady, over Kelham Hall, and the park, and the long drive, and the village, and the road back to Thornfield Park, covering everything with the particular patience of a thing that knows it has all the time it needs. By the time the candles were lit in the library, the park was entirely still, and she could see her own reflection faintly in the dark glass of the window, a woman in a warm room with a fire at her back. And she thought that she had been, in the end, the sort of person who remained, and that the room she had remained in had finally been worth the waiting. She was still quiet. She would always be quiet. She set the notebook down and watched the snow and let herself be still in it, without apology and without diminishment, for the first time in a very long while. If this story moved you, leave a word below. The quiet ones are always worth staying for.